That science of understanding soil is very important, and you've all sort of done it at school and ag college or various courses, and we've always had, yes, soil physics, for example, right? So where we've looked at actually water and the structure and the physics of soils. We've had an enormous amount over the last 70 years on soil chemistry, like what are the actual nutritional processes, and then actually how do we add nutrients to soil, and this very much add-on approach to chemistry. But what we really haven't done so much is to look at actually what the biology of soil is all about. What is the life of the soil, and in a sense, how does that affect the processes, but also how does our management of our soils, our soil chemistry, impinge on that biology, very often in a negative way. And in a sense, how do we make that soil biology, yes, sing and dance for us and give us an underpinning for agriculture in the 21st century? So it's a bit like what Mae West sort of said, about 40 years ago. It's not the soils in our life that matter, it's the life in our soils. She didn't talk about soils, actually. She was talking about something else, but I can borrow that phrase. Okay, so it's the life in our soils. It's the actual living processes in our soils. And in a sense, that's what we want to talk about. Melissa sort of introduced me briefly, and that's all right. I'm a soil microbiologist, spent 25 years in CSIRO and then overseas, China, elsewhere, working on mycorrhizal fungi and, the whole management of soil biology for sustainable, low-input agriculture. Spent a lot of time in the federal government with John Kerrin, John Button, looking at innovation strategies to actually make use of this, because actually another thing we have to talk about critically, it's the viability of your industry, it's the viability of farmers. It's no point having healthy soils and bankrupt farmers. Doesn't work, right? It's the viability of farming. How do we use this to make it viable? But really, 12 years ago, retired, and then basically said, look, we formed this little group, Healthy Soils Australia. It's not little, actually. It's got an extensive network of very innovative farmers, very innovative innovative scientists and what have you that work with it. And it's really looking at that, how do we actually regenerate the health of our soils and landscapes, and in that way underpin, climate, water, food, your very future. And some big, exciting things going on. We've worked very intimately, directly with Michael Jeffrey, our ex-Governor General, and in a sense, through that process, he's now become the national advocate of soil health, across Australia. But again, that's not enough, because basically that's sure policy, that's politics, but it's really farmers, the viability of farmers, how we manage our soil, which is where the foundation is. But, lots of information there, but let's get to the guts of what we're here for. What is a healthy soils? Why do the healthy soils matter? What are the processes that drive soil health? How do we understand them? How do we manage those soils to make that soil health process, that microbial ecology work for us? In a sense, we have to ask then the question, well, what have we done to our soils? In a sense, like where do we stand? What's the status of where we are now? And it's not always good, but the good news is it's recoverable. We can certainly regenerate the health of our soils. Okay, if we want to say how do we do that, clearly we go back to what she did, Mother Nature. How did these soils form? What underpinned soil health processes? Can we actually copy those? And of course, yes, we can. And then what do we do practically, commercially, viably to do that? What are the dividends coming from that? But then coming to the concluding point, what are the practical action agendas that we can do? Okay, so that's in a sense what we wanted to cover. Now we've only got 40 minutes, very briefly, so we're just going to be touching it, but obviously we've got Q&A afterwards. We've got to answer your questions, and so right through the day, let's focus on that that interchange to make that happen. Okay, what are healthy soils? From our point, it's very simple, very pragmatic. Healthy soils are soils that enable healthy plants to grow, healthy biosystems to function. Simple as that, right? Because they're the underpinning, the crucible, the foundation of healthy biosystems. So what it is that soils provide that enable that to happen. We all know agriculture is really the business of solar harvesting, right? You're harvesting solar energy and you're fixing that solar energy in a carbon lattice matrix, and of course drawing down CO2 to do that. You're using plants to do that as your key engine, but those plants don't just need sunshine, CO2, water, nitrogen from the air. They also need minerals and water that only can come from down under. They can only come from our soils. So it's really healthy soils addressing these limiting factors in our soils that are the critical points of action where we, in a sense, in agriculture, manage soils. Okay, it's overcoming those limitations. And in a sense, that's the focus of all our intervention in agriculture, and that's what we have to do well. Okay, so why do they matter? Why do healthy soils matter? Well, they matter fundamentally because, quite frankly, yes, our water, our food, our climate, our habitats, our bioresources depend totally on our capacity to continue to manage those healthy soils. President Roosevelt in the Dust Bowl in America, 1930s, made a very poignant absolute statement. A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. Finite, cactus, kaput. Archaeology, like for those of us who are into archaeology, yeah, we can go through the history of civilizations where basically, 17 out of 20 civilizations have gone into the dust of history because they've degraded their soils. Okay, they've lost their capacity to sustain themselves, so all these glorious empires die, or they have to invent warfare to colonize and exploit the lands of other people to keep surviving. So soils matter. Okay, so the question next then is, what have we done to our soils, right? Where are we at, where we actually sort of managed our soils or mismanagement, what do we have to do? Very simple realities, 13.9 billion hectares of land on this planet, finite, that's it. Okay, and over the last 10,000 years of agriculture, we've in a sense been very, very successful. We've taken 8 billion hectares of primary forest, cleared 6.3 billion hectares of that, burnt the guts out of it, and basically, created a whole lot of, cropping soils, agricultural soils, rangelands to do that. But basically, we've actually changed that biosystem as humans enormously. In doing that, we've oxidized vast quantities of carbon out of those biosystems, and of course, we're getting the blowback of that now through climate change, and that's intensifying, it's locked in, and we're going to have to deal with it. There were 8 billion hectares of primary forest. There were about 5 billion hectares of rangelands, savanna woodland rangelands, and again, we've been extremely successful. We have created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland on this planet, will be. Okay, so now we stand with 3.5 billion hectares of forest, about 6 billion hectares of rangelands, and 5 billion hectares of degraded desert and wasteland. So that's what we've got to work with. But obviously we've got to more than work with it, we've got to understand why and how and what happened, and therefore why and how and what we need to do to turn that around to regenerate the health of our soil and landscape. And in a sense, that's really the imperative, and of course the positive is that yes, we can do that. Okay, so it comes down to, well, how do we do it? And of course, again, we just have to go back to how did she do it? How did Mother Nature do this? And if you don't mind, I'll just step back a little bit into pedogenesis, the science of soil formation, because then again, this pedogenesis, this science of soil formation is actually the underpinning of terrestrial life on this planet. It's the underpinning of your survival. It's the underpinning of our future. Okay, 420 million years ago, there was no life on land. There was just ocean and there was rock. Okay, life had evolved about 3.8 billion years previously, but had been growing in the oceans progressively, and of course learned how to fix solar energy, but it was again, like our soils, like our biosystems now, limited by the availability of nutrients. Those nutrients had to leach from that rock into the ocean, and basically there was an growth of life in the oceans. It was running out of nutrients, and so yeah, obviously something went mongrel. A fungus grew out from that organic marine slime, on the edge of the rock, and grew onto the land to solubilize nutrients from the rock so it would have that limiting factor addressed. But fungi like us, they're heterotrophs, right? They can't fix their own energy, so they need plants to have access to energy, sugars. And so this fungus basically said, look, I've got to form a relationship, a marriage with these blue-green algae. And of course, they've formed this symbiosis. And basically, that is the lichens. Okay? And so all around us, whether it's rock or concrete or logs or whatever, we see lichens biodegrading these materials to solubilize nutrients. And it's those lichens that were the primary microbial drivers of life on land. And those lichens and those processes were the fundamental drivers of everything we are, of ourselves. Because those lichens, as they grew independently and were able to go AWOL across the land, as they died, they left organic detritus, organic matter behind in that mineral, rocky, broken down rocky aggregate. And for the first time, we had the formation of soil. Okay, so soil isn't just mineral aggregate, soil is mineral aggregate plus organic matter. And that word organic matter, carbon, is actually the fundamental thing. So for the first time, we had these lichens putting organic matter into the soil, and that had a profound effect. Because as you put organic matter into soil, you create a sponge. And as you create a sponge, you can hold water. And as you put organic matter in the soil, you create a carbon lattice, and that lattice has massive negative charges on it that can hold nutrients and make nutrients available. And so very rapidly, we ended up forming the primary soil, petagenesis. And then very rapidly, we evolved plants from, those lichens to liverworts, to ferns, to mosses, to cycads, to gymnosperms, to angiosperms, and then to grasses. And very rapidly, we had the evolution, the possibility of evolution of plant life on Earth through this microbial petagenesis soil process. That same process, of course, allowed the extension of plant life all across the planet. And so very rapidly in the Carboniferous and the Permian, 400 million years ago to 300 million years ago, the whole planet then was covered with plants. Those plants drew down massive quantities of carbon from the air to the point that CO2 levels in the atmosphere dropped from 8,000 parts per million roughly down to about 100, lower than it is today. Okay, but all that biomass actually in the Permian sort of burnt, because once you draw down that much carbon and once oxygen levels get above 25%, you end up with spontaneous combustion, so those things burnt. And so again, evolution got smart and said, look, we need herbivores to basically cycle that carbon out from just accumulating biomass, and of course to maintain a balanced, like hydrology, balanced carbon level in the atmosphere. At the same time, that drawdown of carbon, of course, created those very deep organic soils, fossil fuels, stores of carbon, which we're still harvesting and exploiting today, either in our soils or in our fossil fuel use. Okay, so what we're really saying there is a fundamental process in nature which creates soil, which creates life, sustains life, makes water available, makes nutrients available, and in a sense, that's a process that we too now need to harvest. And really, that's the guts of what agriculture and your future is going to be all about. How do you rebuild those soil-forming processes? How do you rebuild that carbon in your soils so you too can have the water, the nutrients, the benefits from that regeneration? Because if you don't do that, we're going back to deserts. We've already got 5 billion hectares of them, but we're going back to aridification and progressively losing that biosystem, losing our future. So how do we actually do that practically, which is really what agriculture is about? And again, that's why I've used this whiteboard, because it's all very simple. It's a very simple question of, A, B, C. And if I can get, look at these are good. Okay, and so basically what's agriculture about? And basically here's agriculture, and it's all about growing this plant to optimize, of course, here's our sun, CO2, there's the soil, here's some roots. Okay, and it's really about maximizing agriculture. And it's maximizing actually the growth and drawdown of growth of plants, biomass, and the drawdown of carbon in that sort of, through that photosynthetic process. And of course, our agriculture has been all about this above ground where we live, and how do we actually maximize that? Because we're using that as crops or as stubble or whatever, right? And of course, we've become very, very proficient at that. Where, in a sense, initially for the first 10,000 years of agriculture we're doing that, like basically cropping, shifting cultivation. But the last 70 years we've got better than that, and we've sort of said, look, we can actually use oil to cultivate, to make fertilizer, to make pesticides, and we can basically drive this production, this yield increase ever more. And I was part of the Green Revolution. The whole object was, we had 3 billion people on the planet then. How do we grow more food? How do we grow more yield? And that was a whole driving force. And of course, we've been very successful. We've got 7.4 people on the planet, and now we're wondering what the bloody hell we were doing. But the point is that it was all about growing things. How do we maximize the fixation of carbon through this growing more plants? And in a sense, that's the space that agriculture is occupied. But we've got to step beyond that now. Because what matters isn't how much we can grow. What matters is what happens to every molecule of carbon that we fix in growing. Like what happens, what are the consequences of that carbon that we fix? And actually all through evolution, all through life on this planet, there's only two things that can happen to every molecule we fix. It can either burn, or it can go into stable soil carbon. Should be the other C, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so there's only two things that can happen. So what matters is not how much we produce, but what happens to it, what will we do to it. And that carbon can either burn off or oxidize, and if it does, it just goes back to CO2 in the air, or we can sort of put that carbon down into our soils, and as we showed in petagenesis, as we showed in the evolution of life on this planet and sustaining of life on this planet, if we put it into the soils, then it can have enormous benefits in terms of water, nutrients, what have you. We'll come into that a little bit in a second. And so the issue is we have agency. This is the only place where humanity influences, the global geo thing in our management of plant growth and whether we burn or whether we put it into carbon. The BC ratio actually governs, whether we go cactus into desert or whether we go into sustainable, viable biosystems. Okay, and at the moment what we're doing, of course, we're sort of cultivating, we're burning, of course, clearing and burning a lot of land, we're cultivating, we've got fertilizers, we've got biocides, we've got irrigation, we've got fallows, and basically all of these are driving 120% of A is going now into B. And it's 120% because we're basically burning oxidizing everything we produce, plus we're burning 20% plus of our heritage, our reserve, our previous stores of carbon that nature has sort of put there. And of course, we've got Charles Keeling in 1958. He gave us the graph, and there's our CO2 going up. And basically, it's significantly a consequence of what we've been doing on the land. This was happening way before we got into exponential use of fossil fuels. Okay, so basically the whole world has been about agriculture, but basically to try and maximize agriculture, we've been engaging a whole lot of practices that basically are just driving more oxidation of carbon. And of course, nature didn't do this. As we said, it grew life on this planet by putting carbon into the soils, that from the lichen down. And the processes that evolved there actually involved, yes, what we said, microbiology, right? These are as we had with the lichens, these are the sort of fungi, and these are the fungi. And somebody asked the question, hey, what's happening to our fungi? But here are the fungi that were turning cellulose and lignin into humates. These are fungi, other fungi, mycorrhizal fungi that were turning root exudates into glomalin. And there were fungi and bacteria in the guts of animals, in the guts of herbivores, that was turning litter and stubble again into biofertilizer and humates. As well, of course, as protein, because these things basically were self-reproducing, weren't they? Okay, so we had microbiology actually enhancing soil carbon. And then once we start looking at these B and C processes, we get to another position. See that basically 40% of the solar energy that we fix generally stays above ground in the shoots of the plants. But there's another 30% in roots, and there's another 30%, but sometimes this goes up to 50%, that is exuded from the roots as sugars to feed these microorganisms. Okay? And so you can see if we say, look, we're fixing 100 units of carbon through plants, basically a lot of that, we can take, if we take 25% of this above ground biomass and 80% of this below ground biomass, we can readily build soil carbon. Nature can grow soil carbon at rates of up to 200 tons per hectare per annum. We don't have to achieve what she can do. She's better than us. But we've got innovative farmers all over the world basically doing 10 tons of carbon per hectare per annum sustainably. This industrial agriculture on average is losing 5 to 10 tons of carbon per hectare per annum. We've recently spent $23 million on a CSRO SCARP program, and the best they could do under this oxidative agriculture, conventional agriculture, is 0.3 tons carbon per hectare per annum. So we're going nowhere. We're going what? We're going backwards, or here's nature and here's the innovative farmers going forward. Okay, so the question comes really from a farming, from a practical, from a, innovation challenge point of view to all of you. Whatever you're doing, if you're livestock, if you're cropping, if you're horticulture, is, okay, how do I change this balance? How do I get out of 120% going up there? We're always going to have some CO2 going up because we need to, otherwise there's no more CO2 for plants to fix. But the point is, how do we make sure a significant part, 60, 70% of the carbon we fix can actually get sequestered as stable soil carbon? We've obviously accepted that, yes, we're going to have to stimulate this microbiology, and that's what we're talking about. Mae West was talking about, how do I get life into my soils? Okay, and so what are the ways to do it? Well, the thing is that these organisms exist naturally in soils. 98% of plants are mycorrhizae. As Melissa said, there's basically 10 billion plus organisms in a teaspoon of soil. massive quantities, 10 times the biomass of organisms in soils than there is biomass above the ground. Fungal hyphae in healthy soils, you're all sitting down, good, 25,000 kilometers of fungal hypha length per cubic meter of healthy soil. Twice the diameter of the earth of microscopic fungal hyphae proliferating throughout that soil across surfaces and actively, selectively absorbing, solubilizing, accessing, transferring, cycling nutrients, water to sustain the life of this plant. And it's that soil microbial root interface, and it's our management of that soil microbial root interface, which is the frontier for sustainable 21st century agriculture. So it's how do we do that? As we said, the organism's already there, but there's actually ways that we can stimulate. There's ways we can accelerate and switch on these organisms. And there's a gentleman here, Barry, from a company called Best, but basically the whole range of biostimulants, things that we can put into the soil at parts per billion to actually switch on some of these microbial processes that have actually been actively repressed by each of these factors, right? All of these have been actually seriously degrading the life in our soil, but the point is it's mostly still there. We can switch it on, and there are sort of, biostimulants and what have you that can help that. It's not just a simple business of, hey, here's a bottle of jungle juice, how do I pour it on? And off she goes. It's a little bit more intelligent, right? Mother Nature's a bit more intelligent. It's a case of, it comes back to you at a regional farmer group intelligence level. What is the experience? What are the local innovators doing? What's working? What rates work? What combinations? And so we're looking at all those innovations, and Joel would know all about them. Here with the cover cropping, here with the integration of herbivores into these ecologies. Here's all the ways that we can sort of bio-amend and biostimulate healthy soils, healthy microbiology. So we're making the point that there is actually very successful, very effective, innovative farmers all over Australia using these practices. 120% of sustainable yield compared to conventional. Less than 20% of the inputs of those conventional farmers. Less than 10% of the risk of those conventional farmers. 300% plus reliability. Okay, with climate change, we're going to be up against it. You guys here in South Australia, 20%, 30% less rainfall, but very, very much less reliable rainfall. So reliability is everything. Can you get a crop? Can you get that crop in 4 years out of 5, or are you down to 2 years out of 5 because of increased variability and extremes? Fundamentally important, reliability. 500% increases in your natural capital values in that land. Okay, these are the ecosystem services. Often you don't get paid for them yet, but these are the ecosystem services that regenerated land develops. So what I'm saying is there are practical, effective innovations, biostimulants, ways that we manage, enhance this, the ways we stop burning as much as we do now, and through that fundamentally transform agriculture into a whole new paradigm of, yes, scratching the surface, putting life back in our soils, being more productive. But let's get to the bottom line, because it's not just a matter of growing now life in our soils, it's also about the viability of farmers. And this is a really important point, because if you're not viable, you can't be green if you're in the red, right? And the bottom line, and we've got a space here, so we'll call this D, and we'll call this dividends, because this is where the rubber hits the road. Because every gram of extra carbon that you can put into your soil, because it improves the structure of the soil, on average can hold up to 8 grams of extra water. Okay, that 8 grams of extra water through your sponge into your in-soil reservoirs can massively extend the longevity of green and the resilience of that plant as we get climate extremes. And that's going to be a critical point for your viability, your productivity, your sustainability. Okay? Basically, it's a longevity of green. You can increase that 300%. You can do all the genetic engineering you like, and you might get 20%. Okay? But basically, the dividends, as in nature, come from making things more resilient, more reliable, longevity of green. So that hydrology, rehydrating those landscapes through improving your soil carbon sponge, your in-soil reservoirs, pays dividends, fundamentally. Every gram of carbon that you put in your soils, so there's 1 gram and there's our water. Every 1 gram of carbon is our soil structure. We've talked about that at the beginning. That increases the structure, the openness, the aeration of soils. It drops its shear strength. It allows, we're all adults here, it allows the improved rootability of our soils. Okay, it allows roots to proliferate and extend to depth. So instead of being stuck with growing things on 20 centimeters of soil, being restricted, whether it's by aluminium toxicity or waterlogging or compaction layers or whatever, by improving that carbon, by improving that soil structure, you can work with 2, 3, 4 meters of soil. In your sands here, it goes down to 10 meters plus. So the volume of soil, the volume of nutrient surface area that soil microbial root interface can work with, again, increases many, many factor-fold. Okay, so the resource interface that you're now working your plants through can be massively increased. No extra inputs, those resources are sitting there. It's just up to us now, 21st century, how do we utilize, how do we cycle from them. Every gram of extra carbon we put into our soils, as we've said before, has a massive lattice of expanded, I'm just drawing this as a lattice thing, expanded organic surface area. This organic matter has massive negative charges on it, right? That's really what it is. These negative charges, of course, are able to then adsorb our essential cations, so whether it's calcium, magnesium, manganese, copper, cobalt, all those essential 33 plus nutrients that we plants need for our health and future can be then absorbed and made available to the plants. The nutrition of plants is governed over 90% by the availability of nutrients when and where that plant needs it. It's got very little to do with what you add to the soil. Okay, and we've had sort of 70 years of moron agriculture, adding, but most of that added nutrient either it becomes toxic rapidly because it's too high, or gets leached, or otherwise gets occluded and made unavailable within weeks. Okay, so we've been in a culture of, again, adding fertilizers, and again, 90% of that added fertilizer within weeks is no longer available. It could be toxic, or when it is available, it is often toxic. So here we are, we've got a completely natural thing. Nature produces highly productive biosystems, rainforests on sand dunes, not by adding nutrients, just by increasing the availability and the efficient cycling of those nutrients through these microbial processes. And again, in 21st century agriculture, the opportunity, the challenge is we can do that as well. But there's a whole wider lecture that we can go on to that whole nutrient dynamics. I mean, please, Melissa, tell me when our time's up. But basically, we can't do that. 1 gram of extra carbon in our soils also is powerfully important because that increases the whole microbial ecology, health of that soil, as we've indicated. And this is, again, fundamental because then that's the thing that gives you immunization against diseases, whether it's insects, fungi, or whatever. That gives you the vigor, the resilience of those plants to compete, their root systems to compete. their root systems, their turgor pressure to resist frost, hail, other sort of stresses. And so we're in a completely different health, soil health, plant health category. And that's, in a sense, what's limiting all those things that are now affecting our agricultural crops, be it, frost, hail, insects, fungi, all those drought stresses, what have you, salinity stresses. So our capacity of our plants to survive in this ecology is so compromised because often we've got root-shoot ratios, like of 1 to 5, right? 20% roots compared to all these shoots that we're growing, whereas in nature it's completely the other way around. Root-shoot ratios of 10 to 1, 10 times more roots down there, building that soil life, soil microbial root interface to drive plant growth upstairs. Okay, so the bottom line is, you see, that every gram of carbon can actually pay enormous dividends. But the really interesting thing is these dividends, each of these things, whether it's water, whether it's soil structure, root proliferation, whether it's nutrient availability, whether it's I've left that one out, nutrient availability, or whether it's that microbial ecology, these are all the things, all these Ds drive the productivity of A in nature. See, so what we've got is a paradigm shift here, because instead of basically saying, okay, we've got to support A by our moron, strategies in the past 70 years, 5, right, good. Instead of saying we have to support more A, we have to feed the world by putting more A on, no, all we need is more D. We need more dividends from this carbon, from this microbiology, and that will do it. If we have these dividends, we wipe out the need for most of that. Now let's get radical, because this is agriculture. We've got to be very careful and conservative, but this is what our innovators are doing. They are producing 120% of yield with less than 20% input, less than 10% of the risk. And of course, you've got $75 billion worth of debt on your shoulders, Agriculture Australia. And you can't survive with that. You've got to get that debt off your back. Okay, and the only way you get that debt off your back is saying, how do I grow better, more wisely, using these dividends rather than these debts? And so again, a paradigm change in agriculture. Okay, so we're running out of time, so just sort of bringing it to the guts of it, it's all about you, farmers, locally, with innovation, saying, yes, what we're doing now, B doesn't work. There are natural, safe options that are there, cost nothing. They deliver massive dividends. They open the door to a new paradigm. They're at your feet. Certainly they're not bottles of jungle juice. Certainly they're not simple prescriptions. They are you working with your innovative leaders. They're working with local agents. They're working with those people driving these innovations nationally and internationally and saying, yes, we can grow healthy plants. That is the only way we're going to meet, whether it's our water, our food, our climate imperatives. We've got 10 years before things start falling apart very, very seriously. Agriculture, regenerative of soils are really fundamental in that. And basically, it's in your hands. So scratching the surface is more than going down under. It's actually securing your future. Thank you very much. Right, yeah, look, I mean, and this is, Dick will talk a bit more about that whole grazing management, no question. Look, plants will obviously grow, and like everything, they grow and then they become mature and then they die, right? And so everything goes through this sort of normal life cycle. And obviously, yeah, there's one set of biomass, but if we basically say, look, we're growing it and then we harvest it, it'll grow again and it'll grow again. Okay, and so we effectively can do this, A, B, C, D, And so effectively, instead of just having one lot of growth and then it's sort of being stagnant and moribund and sort of declining, we can say, look, and this is how nature's built productivity. No, we have a herbivore. We can remove, we can remove that. It'll regrow. And so instead of having just A, we've now got A, B, C, and D. This, if we just left it at A, this was at extreme risk of fire. So writing. So do you understand? Like we just had what we've got now all over these fire risks, massive fire risks, because we're leaving all this fuel, dry fuel there. No, you put it down through the gut of an animal. You've got biofertilizer, you've got sort of carbon in the soil, you've got protein, and you've got a future. So the herbivores, the integration of herbivores into this ecology that we talked about, fundamentally beneficial. And so, again, this is what Dick and Alan Savory and others, of course, are doing. So how do we integrate that into our agriculture? Each of these A, B, C's, and D's aren't just producing protein, milk, but they're also, of course, putting biofertilizers and soil carbon into the soil. So we're pumping carbon into the soil through that efficient grazing management. There's a lot more to talk about, but hopefully that gives you a snapshot there. Yeah, well, okay, now the question is, when we have 100% cropping, okay, in the new paradigm we have to ask the question, do we want to have 100% cropping? You may not have room to put animals on your place, but if there was a phone number that you could ring up to say, look, I need 10,000 animals for 2 weeks there to turn my stubble back into, soil carbon and biofertilizer so I can grow a green manure crop or green bridge crop or the second crop, do you want that phone number? And so this is a whole new paradigm for rural business. So do you have and Joel's had that sort of concept too, how do you have a higher herd regional capacity where you do integrate herbivores back into cropping, but you don't try to necessarily do it all within the four fences of your place? Very important. Again, Joel's written books about, that mentoring and that transition. Yeah, it's not easy, and we're psychologically and economically and culturally imprinted with one pattern. It's not easy. It's a big issue, and that's what we're talking here for. Look, it's about innovators. Here are the leading innovators in your areas that are doing it. It's documenting the evidence, right? This is what they're achieving, 120% yield, 20% of inputs. You basically joining that regional discussion group and getting the confidence of that. And then, then you're saying, okay, how do I start progressively? What's my strategy? How do I start progressively? You don't go cold turkey, but how do I move that paddock, or here's a clapped out paddock, how do I regenerate that under the new principles? Okay? And then there's also, and again, we raised that before, here are your local mentors, advisors, people with, tools and support, involve them in those groups, have that group discussion, and then just plan that forward. But yeah, it's a social change thing. We're social animals. Overcoming those impediments, those psychological impediments, is a key frontier. But it's doable, and these regional farmer groups are really powerful in doing that. And it's the only way things do change. They don't change for politics, right? Okay, well look, absolutely, you deep rip because you're trying to sort of get structures that allow roots to proliferate to depth, right? And that's laudable. But the question is, do you need to deep rip, or can you use basically soil carbon and pioneer plants, jackhammer plants to open up that soil structure for you actually in a smarter way? And so when we're looking at a lot of the cover cropping and other sort of strategies like that, can you get to the same opening up that soil structure, getting your roots down without needing to actually spend all that money on ripping, right? There's no dogma here, okay, whatever is needed to make it work, but always look at the balances. Okay, how much am I destroying soil structure? How much am I oxidizing? What are my input costs for deep ripping? Is it the smart thing? And certainly I don't want to be trapped and mainlined or hooked up on having to do it all the time, right? And the same goes with fertilizer. No one's saying that you can't use fertilizers. Plants need nutrients, no question. But basically, can we switch it from adding nutrients, to sort of saying, okay, how much bang for the buck can I get from cycling and increasing availability? So, I mean, again, this is where the last question, you go locally, what's the experience there? Where are people who have used other strategies to build soil structure? And then what are the other local alternatives to that, right? Okay, yeah, and see, this is a whole world now. We all accept that, yeah, like bugs are good, right? We scratch the surface, life in soil is good. And so we get in the mindset of, okay, how do I add bugs? Do I have to buy inoculum? And then how do I actually brew them and so forth? The bottom line is, look, nature, as we sort of said, 10 times biomass, microbial biomass, down under compared to above the surface. So, but mostly often they're very repressed, suppressed, and what have you. So the idea of, yes, stimulating that natural microbial population, absolutely necessary. Does brewing and adding foreign bugs help? Well, we've done a lot of work on this, and the sad thing is in 99% of cases, those added bugs aren't to be found within, 18 months of adding them, right? So it's much more looking at, okay, how do I stimulate what's there? But what you're talking about, brewing, compost teas and what have you, comes back into this biostimulant area. It's not that the bugs that you're adding that are doing it, but you're actually saying, I'm creating conducive conditions for the native bugs to get going again from some of those plant extracts, worm juice, worm leachates, etc. And of course, they're extremely important and effective. So the practical answer is, yes, you're doing the right thing, trying to, how do I rebuild that life in that soil? And then again, in that regional discussion groups, talking to people about vermiculture, biostimulants and stuff, find out what the experience has been, what are the, additives that work. Generally speaking, you don't need to focus on, I've got to add bugs. You can re-stimulate the native bugs. You only have to do it once or twice. It's not a thing that once you've got an active microbial ecology working, as in nature, it's there for good. So there's, upside, but work in your local groups to sort of say, okay, what's the sweet spot, what's the optimum practice, and then just build on that. Okay, so if I got all the question right, I mean, obviously tillage, again, if you've got basic structural problems, you've created a hard pan because you've used a rotavator. Sometimes you say, yeah, look, I can till and break it up. As in the previous questions, no, look, here are roots that create that structural improvement. How much can I move towards roots doing that job for me, deep penetrating roots? I don't want to be radical, but basically there's some very, very effective pioneer plants who do just that in nature, right? They've got good, strong, deep tap roots, proliferate roots, and they're really the pioneer colonizing plants on, degraded soils. And they're extremely effective, jackhammer plants, and you can grow them. The trouble is we often put them on weed lists, right? Because some agronomists have said, hey, these appear on a weed list. But look, again, work in your groups, work in the information. No plant, there's no weed that's taken over the world. Every plant, by simply growing, changes that soil to the better, and by growing and changing it to the better, excludes itself from continuing to grow there. Okay, so nothing stays there forever. So these are pioneer soil colonizing plants that you can use and basically properly manage, no problems. The other question is, how do I bring herbivores in to do that tillage? Pigs and stuff, absolutely excellent, because that's exactly the law of ecology, the first law of ecology, right? Petagenesis. The next law was, if you can't beat them, eat them. look, this is fundamentally important because our food now, and this may take a little bit over time, or otherwise we can...
now.
Oh, okay. Okay, but basically our food under industrial agriculture now contains roughly a third of the nutrient concentration that food pre-World War II did. It often contains 0 of the 33 essential nutrients, particularly the trace elements that we need in parts per billion for our biochemistry and our health. Without those nutrients, without that tracing, we're really sick, cancers and what have you, right? And so we've got a real problem with the nutritional integrity of our food. And so we've got a real problem with how our food is grown, because only how we grow our food determines its nutritional integrity. Foods grown naturally through these biological processes operate on completely different nutrient uptake processes compared to our industrial hydroponic agriculture. Fundamentally different nutrient process. So it's not a matter of, hang on, does an organic apple taste better than a, industrial apple? It has completely different nutritional contents and integrities because it was grown under different nutrient uptake processes. And we can go into a lot of details, but we haven't got time just now, but we can perhaps raise it this afternoon in more detail, so ask that again. But basically, the fungi proliferating through that 25,000 kilometers of fungal healthy, they take up nutrients directly from soil surfaces across their membranes in an active, selective, intelligent uptake processes. So they'll take up the nutrients they need, they'll concentrate them, they will actively exclude the toxins and the nutrients they don't need. And so what the fungi gets, what the plant gets, what we get is gone through a intelligent QA process, quality assurance processes by those fungi. The food that we grow in our industrial hydroponics has aborted that interface totally. Its nutrition is totally dependent on what that plant can take up from the soil solution. Whatever soluble ions in that soil solution, that plant will take up as if it was a straw. And if it's a lot of cadmium and lead and aluminium and toxic materials, which they are in the soil solution, the plant will then concentrate them, our food will have them. As we said before, the essential nutrients, your calcium, your magnesium, and your selenium, your cobalt, all those trace elements, they're bound up on those organic matter surfaces. They're available, but they're attached like Velcro to those surfaces, and they don't appear in the soil solution. So our hydroponic, industrial hydroponic, doesn't get access to any of those, or most of those trace elements from those cation exchange systems, only what's in the soil solution. So that's, in a sense, a fundamental divide between how plants take up nutrients, the nutrient integrity of those two types of food, and quite frankly, that relates directly back to our preventative health and why we're running $150 billion a year disease industry in Australia, and of course much, much more globally. And basically, that's the point why healthy people need healthy food from healthy soils, and where the whole paradigm for 21st century agriculture has to differentiate itself and go back to consumers to say, here is your health,